I love a fight, and I just do. And, there is something to that fighting Irish thing, and I do love a fight. And I mean, there is nothing better to fight than a communist. I mean, it's what I was born for. It's what I was brought up for. And I mean, here is a chance to fight the Communist Party of China.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. So this week, we're kicking off a series, a deep dive into a subject that has been niggling at me for some time. And that's becoming more and more prevalent in the space domain. And that's hybrid warfare, gray zone actions that are intended to impose a loss, a cost, an injury on space capabilities and national defense. But do not cross the threshold. That can't be defined as acts of war. The easiest examples are jamming and spoofing the radio signals that carry satellite communications and other space-based data. Jamming imposes a temporary loss of capability, and it certainly isn't considered an act of war. And neither is buying shares in a high-tech company or even joining that company's board in order to gain access to a company's intellectual property secrets. Or legal actions, like filing multiple lawsuits and appeals in more than one jurisdiction or nation. These less than acts of war are types of warfare. This episode is looking at lawfare. We're going to hear first from Declan Ganley, the CEO of Rivada Space Networks, and then Dean Cheng, probably one of America's most sought-after authorities on China and defense issues. We're starting with a discussion with Declan Ganley because in courtrooms in at least 4 countries, Rivada has been facing off against at least 2 Chinese companies. These Chinese companies have at least strong, if not direct, political and substantial financial support from the government of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese companies are Shanghai Spacecom Satellite Technology, or SSST, and CED, which seemingly only goes by that acronym. Shanghai Spacecom Satellite Technology is best known for starting to put into orbit its 1,000-sails communications satellite mega-constellation. SSST's goal is to launch 15,000 into low Earth orbit and compete directly against the U.S.-owned SpaceX Starlink constellation. This is in accordance with an official PRC goal. But here's the problem. The intellectual property behind some of the technology aboard the 1,000-sail satellites may have been illegally pilfered from a company in Germany called K-LEO. For some years now, a German concern called 80LEO and Rivada on one side, and the Chinese companies on the other side, that's SSST, and the other Chinese company, CED, they're all current shareholders in the K-LEO company, and they have been engaged in an epic 2-sided war for control of K-LEO and therefore its technology. It's essentially allied nations versus the Chinese in the boardroom. So just a few weeks ago, the German courts handed the Chinese companies and therefore their PRC government backers a serious legal loss. And then the Chinese companies seemingly fumbled their ability to appeal. The result is SSST and CED cannot wholly own 100% of the shares of the company K-LEO. And there's a lot more to this story, and it's ongoing in real time. So here's my conversation with Rivada's CEO, Declan Ganley. Hey, Declan, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Good to be back on, Laura.
Now, since the first time I had you on the podcast, and that was just about, 9 weeks ago or so, you've had some very positive legal developments, and I mean Rivada. 2 very important legal outcomes. One is a judgment, and the other is a missed deadline of sorts. Let's set the stage for where these events have taken place. First, they are both in Germany. The judgment, which was handed down, I believe, on May 19th, and it affirmed the decision of the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy It was a German government decision that was being challenged, and the decision from the court was that two mainland Chinese space businesses or entities are prohibited from owning 100% of a German company that Rivada has a stake in. And the other development is that one of those Chinese companies, that's the very well-funded government-backed Shanghai Spacecom Satellite Technology Limited, or SSST, it missed a significant court deadline. That second one is a wee bit more complicated than not turning in your homework, as it involves depositing funds into a court-appointed escrow account. But we're going to get into that a little bit later, right? And this is just the latest in what has been at least 140 lawsuits and counter lawsuits. And gosh, Declan, how many years has this been going on?
Too many.
but seriously, man. I mean, we're talking like 3, 5.
Well, but yeah, with my involvement, our involvement, just over 3 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, and that is 140 since your involvement. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a ton.
Yeah, I think it's 152 in total.
Wow.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of activity in a very short period of time. So because this is, just a wee bit complicated and expensive, what Rivada has already spent roughly $50 million on legal fees.
Ballpark. Yeah, slightly less than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Only slightly.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
But the thing I want to do for our audience is I want you to take us back to the beginning. Rivada, you established Rivada in the aughts as a communications company. And in the last handful of years, you've expanded the company's interest to include satellite communications and very specifically building a very secure space-based broadband internet that you call the Outernet. And as part of that expansion, Rivada acquired stakes in the German company K-LEO. That German company had the patents for K-band satellite technology. And you also got stake in another company that's incorporated in Liechtenstein. That one is Trion. That company, Trion, held the rights to K-band spectrum that K-LEO had signed a contract for with Trion to use, right? For what K-LEO and Trion had kind of hoped would develop into a satellite constellation with commercial, government, and military customers. That's already a lot of players, but still straightforward enough. But this story is anything but, because at the time Rivada jumped in, the business relationship between K-LEO and Trion and their shareholders was anything but straightforward. These two companies, when they needed cash, brought in Chinese investors that were backed by the People's Republic of China. Could you briefly fill us in on who was involved and what the state of play was when Rivada joined the fray?
Yeah, the what had happened, and I'm going to, for in the interest of not losing people's attention and for brevity, what happened was the German founders of Clear Connect had come up with a brilliant concept, and they were brilliant engineers, and had gone to Liechtenstein because the Liechtenstein regulatory system was the one that was best positioned to move swiftly in the application for a Ka band license
for spectrum,
for radio spectrum. And they went through the Liechtenstein regulatory office to do that, to make an application to the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is a sort of it's affiliated with the United Nations. It predates the United Nations, actually, but the ITU is the entity that governs the management of radio spectrum between nation states. So obviously, satellite, which came long after the ITU was first established, by its very nature, it deals with cross-border radio spectrum issues. And so the ITU is a natural sort of place to park that kind of responsibility. And when these applications are made to the ITU, they go through a national regulator. And there are a number of countries that have made this an area of specialization, some more than others. I mean, for example, the first Starlink license was from Norway. There are licenses that come from Rwanda. our Outernet 1 licenses through the German regulator, but these two particular licenses, 3Com1 and 3Com3, were filed through the Liechtenstein regulator. And the entity in Liechtenstein, you mentioned Trion, that had those frequency use agreement rights was called Trion, and Trion was owned, it was being controlled by this entity called Clio Connect, which was a German company. Now, the German company was the operating company, and that's where the engineering, etc., was being done. And once they had got the license, the frequency allocation, they went out to raise money. Now, this is a good number of years ago, to raise money and find investors. And they got a compelling offer from a Chinese company to take a small stake in their company, a small minority stake. I believe it was 10% at the beginning, and had a shareholders agreement put in place that was then somewhat ignored or worked around, and became the instrument by which what I will describe as a hostile takeover was mounted of this German company by the Chinese side. A lot of other things happened. The Chinese launched 2 satellites into the orbital slots covered by these license rights. There was a very clear
And
process.
they did this without the founders' blessing.
Yes,
right?
And they started to really mirror the whole German operation in China with a plan clearly to move the operations and the execution of this to China.
So that would be kind of like an exfil operation.
Yes. And so I became aware of this situation as I was doing due diligence on LEO satellite, low Earth orbit satellite radio spectrum, and where the priority allocations sat. I became aware and saw that there had been a hostile takeover operation. It also was very clear that there was no way to salvage that project with the Chinese. There was a zero chance of that thing going forward. The Chinese had already engaged in major litigation against the founders. I still have to be a little bit careful about what I talk about. I can talk in general terms rather than specific terms.
Well, then maybe generally speaking, it was a hot mess.
Yeah. And when you see something that, and lawfare is a term that has become overused politically. Everything now is lawfare, lawfare, lawfare. Lawfare, when used as a tool of economic warfare, it has very, and by the way, in People's Liberation Army doctrine, it is a valid tool of warfare, and it is called for, and they specify how to use it and what its objectives are for. And that is in PLA doctrine. And it's to destabilize, destroy, compromise, capture things that are of interest to the attacking force and to be extracted from or won over from the quote unquote enemy.
So when you showed up, right, it was a hot mess. We had technology that was being captured, exfiltrated, exported to Shanghai. There were shareholders. The Chinese held the majority of the shares, but not that much more than 50%, but still 50% nonetheless. But you bought into this, I believe, by acquiring Celeste, which was another shareholder.
Correct. So we acquired Liechtenstein entity, which was the other shareholder. And there was a very clear shareholders agreement, which very clearly had been violated. The process by which the operations were to be managed was not being complied with.
So what I'm thinking is that the Shanghai Spacecom Satellite Technology, or SSST, and CED, which was the other, or is the other, Chinese business organization, I imagine that they weren't too happy to see a well funded international company with offices in the US and in Europe and with government contracts show up to stay permanently. And yes, I am talking about you and Rivada, because let's face it, y'all not pushovers. So, what was the first sign of trouble after you joined the fray? Where were you? And how did you learn of what was really the first salvo, the first lawsuit that Rivada encountered of what has ballooned into a full-fledged legal war? Or perhaps did you fire the first shot?
Well, I mean, the shots had been fired. We ended up walking into a very active battlefield, but we could see that. We knew what we were doing. We could also see who the good guys were and who the bad guys were was very, very clear. And in terms of being able to make sure that the project could be brought to success was very important. Yet entered into the battlefield, who was firing first or where were the shots coming from. Honestly, I can't remember. It was just, it was hot and heavy, and but it was very clear that the Chinese wanted this asset. They wanted complete control of it, and as we got further and further into the engineering due diligence and understanding of the architecture and the capabilities of what we now call the Internet, it became very clear to me and others working with me, why they would want something that would be the world's very first completely self-contained global communications network covering every square meter of the surface of the planet and not requiring a ground relay station, not needing to use a single subsea cable, and entirely being independent of the internet, delivering over long distances what would be the lowest latency, fastest, and most physically secure communications network in the globe that could survive the collapse of the internet, or, for example, something like the sabotaging of all of the subsea cables or some of the subsea cables, that in such a circumstance, there would be one network left standing, and this would be it. And that's the brilliant German engineering that was at the heart of this thing from the very beginning. And there is a plethora of ingredients that make that thing what I just described. It's not just the lasers or just the the routing that you're using, or just the altitude, or just the fact that they're in all polar orbits. It's a combination of a multiplicity of factors that give this thing its uniqueness. And because of that uniqueness, it was being treated as a prize of great importance to the Chinese. And that explained the lengths to which, frankly, I was shocked at first to see what was being done in terms of pursuing some of the founders, even personally,
What
as
shocked
well as
you?
corporately.
What shocked you? What hit you to the bone where you're like, no, this is insane.
It's stuff like, I mean, if I got into the weeds and explained it, your listeners would go, no, not that level. Like when you're waging lawfare, so for example, you would find, and it didn't just shock us, it kind of shocked and overwhelmed the legal systems. So you would find that there would be a filing made on a completely flaky basis to get an injunction on some issue or on some matter to stop you from being able to do whatever the next thing would be. And, in Europe or in the United States, someone files for an injunction and you file with the court and you file with, you put in one filing and you serve the other side and the other side has a chance to respond and everything else. And you'd have an injunction filing being made, you would find out about it, you'd get served, and you would file your defense to the injunction, and we would defeat it. And then 3 weeks later, you'd be told, well, you can't do this because there's an injunction against you on this thing. And you'd say, well, no, we defeated that injunction. They'd say, no, here's the injunction. And you'd find out that what they did is they filed at the same time 5 separate identical applications for an injunction, you would get notified of 1 or maybe 2 of them, but you wouldn't be notified about the other 3 that were identical. But they went to different judges. But the judges, they wouldn't be talking to each other about comparing notes on everything, because who does this? And so one of the 5 torpedoes would hit. You only knew about 2 of them. And then you wake up and you find out, hang on, there's an injunction, and they've notified you after the appeal space to appeal the injunction has passed, where you have to go through a much more expensive, long process to overturn that injunction, even though you had won on that case by having it denied at the very beginning. And look, I know this sounds complicated, and it's like, what did he just say? Yes. Yeah, rewind, replay, okay? So you're not hit one time with the same suit, you're hit 5 different times. And what they did in one instance, the lawyer that received the service wasn't working for us; he was working for them.
That's not very helpful.
Seems
that would be, I believe, the quintessential definition of self-serving.
Right, but when legal systems are not used to being gamed like this, and this is why you've got to read PLA doctrine on lawfare. Not only does it have no respect for the legal jurisdictions that it's operating in, it uses them, it weaponizes them to use them against the quote unquote enemy, right? So these are enemy legal systems that it's completely legitimate to use against the quote unquote enemy. So if you're in the perspective of those waging lawfare, say the PLA doctrine, if your legal system is not capable of resisting being gamed this way, that's your tough luck. And by the way, there are Western law firms making literally millions of euros and millions of dollars. So that's one example. But then other things would happen. We had in one of our first big wins, which was in Liechtenstein. I'm going back 2.5 years now or so.
Gosh, you make it seem like it was 10 years ago.
Yeah,
that's a lot's gone down, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So we had a win. We had a very big win, and we had a very good law firm working. We have all very good law firms. I'm not going to name them here now, but 2 of the law firms in particular, the litigators that worked on this, were doing a cracking job. And they went in and they delivered a really resounding defeat against the Chinese side on one issue. And that same day, within an hour of the result coming out, we had a massive cyber attack on Rivada, on our banking and wire transferring process systems. And the law firm that delivered the win for us had a DDoS attack on all of their systems. So their other clients couldn't reach them, their websites went down, and even their cell phones in Europe were not working because they were being overwhelmed in this DDoS attack. And, can I prove that it was X was doing Y? I can't prove it. And this is the brilliance of this thing is when you have this whole
but there was a message being sent.
And the message to the law firm is you want to keep doing this for these guys? Do you like having other clients that can reach you? And then there's another layer, which is that in my case and in the case of some others, we're literally being followed around. I mean, I had a friend that was tagging me when I was in Germany, when I was in Switzerland, and when I was in Liechtenstein.
Wow. And was this tag a Chinese national, or was this tag a European national?
I didn't get to check his passport. He didn't look like his grandparents were from Glenamaddy, County Galway. Let's put it that way.
Sorry for that person.
Yeah. So this. And look, maybe it was just a guy that looked like he was from China who just decided to be in all the same places as me at the same time and had nothing to do with any of this.
Wow.
Yeah, it got fun and so much fun. At one point, I called somebody that had a very long background in this sort of area, and I said, "Hey, aren't these guys supposed to like wear sunglasses or fake beards and hide behind trees and stuff like that?" And he said, "Well, no, this is another way of doing it. This is the get in your head method, and it's for a different reason, but this is the other way." So
This could be considered intimidation.
so I had, well, I have to say I did have some fun with it. So there was a big meeting. Actually, this was in Liechtenstein. We had a fairly big team in there. And then after the team left, I had some other meetings to do over the following 2 days, and I upgraded to the one 5-star hotel in Liechtenstein. So I moved from one hotel to the 5-star, and my pal got upgraded as well, obviously. So he's back. He's in my hotel. So, like most human beings, they get an upgrade or everything else. They want to, benefit from all the perks. Are you going to have the ice cream sundae on United in Polaris class? Yeah, of course you are. And so this guy orders everything for breakfast. So he's like ordering a lot. So I just wait and I wait. And as his pancakes arrive and everything else, I get up and I leave. No bacon for you.
Yeah. That's good.
No. It's anyway. So you can have some fun with this stuff.
But let me bring it back down though to, hate to say it down, but it is sort of down, comparatively speaking, in terms of the vibe. But let's get back to the legal actions, right? Because running around Europe and having a friend is all good and well. But these legal actions, boiling them down, because there really are too many turns in all 140, 152, as you said. But what I see as just an outsider, that there are two critical pieces, and one is the very special spectrum that the ITU, which you explained, which we so lovingly call the International Telecommunication Union, right? It granted that radio spectrum to the government of Liechtenstein, which, it makes sure that everybody recognizes that it belongs to Liechtenstein. So that spectrum, which is a K-band spectrum, and I believe it's a Ka band and a Ku band, that spectrum is used by governments and specifically militaries. And the other issue is K-LEO satellite technology and how they bring all those different ingredients into to create that very special network. But so there's really two big parts to this, right? The spectrum and the technology. So what I want to know is that how is this important to Rivada's plan?
Well,
what does it mean to you?
We've done a lot. We've added a lot to the technology since Rivada got involved. We've made some changes, I would say some upgrades. And some of those just come with, there's technology and things that are operating and work now that didn't even exist when this was first conceptualized. So, those have been layered in, if you will.
But for your business case, this is pretty critical piece too. For your forward plans.
Absolutely, because what we are doing is we are serving large enterprise and government customers and providing them with data sovereignty, data residency, and data security. And what does that mean? It means that when you are using the Rivada's Outernet, you will not be touching any other network. You will not touch the internet. You will have complete control and ownership of your data wherever you move it across the planet. As long as it stays on the Outernet, you keep it on the Outernet, you will have an audit trail. It does not go through the highways and byways of the internet. It doesn't go through gateways. It doesn't go through public switches. It remains entirely yours. And you have complete control of it. And that's the residency thing. So, for example, were you to have this and you're using it across, let's say, a network of your embassies, it never leaves your sovereign control at any point.
And so I would imagine that this is really important for the Chinese organizations, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because they want it. This is
Sure.
this is unique. This is not something that is. This is not something that's like other things. You can't really spoof it or
No,
intercept it or
no.
anything like that. You got to have the router or you don't have the router, and that's just the end of it. So what I'd like to know.
Well, it also means that you can control a device, a thing. You can control a thing and maintain control of it that's literally on the other side of the planet from you. And it is still entirely on not a virtual private network, an actual private network. You're not touching anybody else's thing. You could be controlling something,
And nobody
flying.
else is touching your thing.
Correct. And there's no
Right.
way to do that. So you could be driving something that's doing 20,000 miles an hour, and you could be in direct contact with that thing in real time with the lowest latency communications path on the planet, and you're not touching anybody else's network at any point. And you could do that anywhere on the planet. So you don't need to have a ground relay station in Chile or Argentina or in India or whatever else. You can be sitting and running that thing from your laptop in pick any point of the planet, and you are in control of that thing that's on the opposite side of the planet directly.
So that again brings me right back again to the Chinese. What have they done with K-LEO's intellectual property, the technology? What was it and how have they employed it? Because they have employed it. So Declan, as you're a bit reticent to actually say what it's being used in, what if I say what I've found on the internet, right? Going through government records, both in Europe as well as also in China. And what I have found, and just confirm or deny if you could, that SSST has used the technology, the IP, right? That's intellectual property from Germany, from K-LEO, to put into what's known as the G60 satellite constellation, which is also known as the Yuanxin satellite. And the Yuanxin satellite is also known as the Qianfang constellation, which we call here in the West, and I have reported on before, is actually the Thousand Sails constellation, which is part of China's initiative to create its own version of SpaceX's Starlink. And they wanted that because they saw how well it was used and employed in Ukraine, right? So that really woke them up. So in addition to these Chinese entities, such as the city of Shanghai, there have been some very interesting investors in this, including CAS Star. CAS is the Chinese government. Basically, it's a Chinese government-backed fund. That's the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So that is hardcore Chinese Communist Party land. And they've launched, according to what I have read, they've launched a couple of times. In August, and I believe just recently in December, and there may have been another launch even after that, though I'd have to check, right? But they have been launching these satellites that are based off of the K-LEO intellectual property. Is that right, what I'm saying?
It's not wrong, Laura. In terms of what K-LEO developed and in terms of what Rivada has added subsequent to our becoming involved, it's quite different now. But that said, the core IP, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Just to simplify it for the audience can collectively understand this in English as the Thousand Sails constellation.
Yes, it was called G60 originally, or maybe not originally, but in one of its naming regimes because of the name of a highway that was going past the headquarters of where this was going on in China. So that's why they called it apparently G60 for a period of time. And look,
we have strange names here in the West. We've got a company called Google, right?
Yeah, there's these. You'll hear different names, but it's quite often the same thing. Yeah.
All right. So let's get back to the recent decisions and the, I guess, non-event of not paying into an escrow account. And I realize I am oversimplifying, and I'm doing that on purpose because there have been metric tons of decisions in between. But what are the latest developments and why are they important? Starting with the court affirmation that the German government was right to block SSST and CED from carrying out their plan to acquire 100% control of K-LEO. Why is that important?
This is going back a number of years. So when we did the redemption, they triggered a counter. They tried to trigger a counter redemption.
And let's just explain what a redemption is, folks.
A redemption is where you say, I'm buying your shares, and I'm buying your. So you've got shares, and you have, for the whatever the reasons may be for the redemption, you cite the reasons for the redemption. And subject to the shareholders agreement, I can redeem you and buy your shares for the following reasons: X,
it's
Y, Z.
Basically a forced buyout.
Correct, and that's what a redemption is. So there was a redemption against them, and they triggered a counter redemption. The counter redemption was deemed to be illegal by the German government. And it triggered a review by the German Ministry of Economy. And they published a very interesting report. And for people that really want to get in the weeds, if you were to read the German Ministry of Economy decision, the original decision, which was challenged by the Chinese, which gave the reasons for why they denied this and deemed it not valid and illegal, it's a very, very revealing document because they really get into a lot of detail, and they talk about the lawfare and some of the things that we've touched on here.
But the bottom line is this: the German government has said that a German company, that's K-Leo, cannot be 100% owned by foreign entities, very specifically Chinese foreign entities.
Correct.
I should probably be more exact and say non-EU entities or non-allied entities, right? So why was SSST's decision to not pay 2 million euro into a court-appointed escrow account another really critical development?
In short, it means they have no way back. So they have no way ever to get back K-Leo. That door has now been shut, and in fact, they shut it on themselves. So you can speculate as to why that happened. Was it a mistake? I mean, there are 101 other things going on. Did they think that there would be another opportunity to do it a week later? I don't know, but that is in effect what it means is there is no way back. The door is shut.
That's amazing, right? So how is this constellation that the Chinese are trying to do with K-Leo's tech and with spectrum that they don't seem to actually own, but with K-Leo's tech, I mean, how is that affected? Is it affected?
That will be determined by courts, but certainly the fact that they now have no even theoretical way to own K-Leo, and what it means that the IP that they stole from K-Leo is not theirs, and it's not theirs to use, to deploy, or to operate in this constellation. They're not going to end up owning Clio Connect again and somehow managing to come up with a story for how the Clio Connect IP ended up in their constellation.
Wow. So my understanding is that all of K-Leo's shareholders are participating in a binding arbitration to decide whether Rivada and Eddie Leo can forcibly buy out the Chinese against their will. And yet, all legal, according to the company charter that everyone signed up to, right? That arbitration decision is due before the end of this year. Am I right about that?
Yes, you are.
So I got to ask about the spectrum, right? So can they, as in SSST, just go and use the spectrum that Liechtenstein holds the rights to? And I should bring the audience up to speed here a wee little bit, because once the shareholder infighting reached a point of no return, both at K-Leo and also at Trion, the Liechtenstein company with the radio spectrum, which Rivada also owns a stake in, that's Trion, it canceled the contract with K-Leo. And now Liechtenstein has re-awarded the spectrum license away from Trion, away from K-Leo, really, to Rivada, right? At least in the rulings that I have read. So how does that affect SSST's 1,000 Sails constellation, or does it? Because they're purpose built to use that spectrum, right?
Well, so SSST's constellation, to the best of my knowledge, they claim that they are not using the Ka band spectrum. They are claiming to be using a different band of spectrum. That's what they are saying. The Liechtenstein filings with the ITU, which the Chinese have no right or ability to use that filing or to use that spectrum. However, and this is where it gets to be a bit complicated, the Ka band and other bands for satellite spectrum are not for exclusive use. And this is where it gets really interesting and in the weeds. It is shared spectrum. That is to say, when you go up and you are using the Ka band spectrum, and it's a huge block of radio spectrum, you are using exactly the same radio spectrum as other satellite operators. So what you have to put in place is an agreement between operators on non-interference, basically to make sure that you are using the commons in a way that does not create difficulties for other operators. So and this is not a perfect description, but what a license gives you is a key, if you like, to walk onto the commons and be able to use it. Now, all access rights to the spectrum are not created equal. It's a little bit like a patent. It's not perfectly like that, but it's a bit like it. So it's a sort of who was granted, who came first with their application. And this is where, and there's different blocks of spectrum. So for example, our Outernet 1 filing through the German regulator has got a number 1 priority place. Why? Because the timing of when that filing went in accordance with the allocation of spectrum that was made for the commons, it was the very first application that went in. Same applies with the Liechtenstein filings and that block of the Ka band. It was the first filing that went in. Now, that gives you a priority. And the way I have described this in the past, and again, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's the best thing I can come up with, is it's a bit like being on boarding group 1, Diamond Plus, whatever. You get to go in and board the plane first. It doesn't mean you have the whole plane. It doesn't mean you can take every seat, but you get to board first.
And you get to bring on your carry-on luggage and put it where you want.
Exactly. That's a great way of thinking.
Okay.
But you can go and you can actually take up as much luggage space as you need and all of that stuff. So that's a privilege that it gives you. Also, everybody that has a lower priority has got an obligation to coordinate with everybody above them. So there's a sort of mother may I component to this, which is that you are obliged with a lower priority to coordinate with those that have a higher priority than you. Boarding group 1 does not have the right to punch boarding group 6 in the face. That said, if the boarding group 1 right to the spectrum was in the hands of a bully or in the hands of somebody that was willing to wage lawfare against other operators, or willing to be a bad actor and sort of, stick their elbows out in the space, it could get very interesting. There is scope for delay, troublemaking, frankly, jamming, and all sorts of misbehavior that if the law was on your side, you could say, well, hang on, we've got boarding group 1. And they'll say, but he pushed me. So I didn't push you. I was just trying to get on and you were in the way and you pushed me. So it's being able to argue from a point of having the high ground in international law. And you can look at what China does on the high seas or around the Philippines or the Spratly Islands or wherever. And it doesn't take too much of a leap of imagination to figure out where this could end up were it to be misused in any way. So that's the significance of priority. That's the significance of spectrum allocations. And that's the significance of why the Chinese cannot use those filings.
So now it looks like Rivada, you, and K Leo's German founders, 80 Leo, it looks like y'all have the upper hand, right? So I got to ask you, because I know you a little bit and I know where you spent some of your formative years, and there's a track record. You're a fighter in a pinstriped suit. You don't shy away from a rumble. Why did you choose this path? Ostensibly, it was with the blessing of Rivada's board, but this was a fight before you and Rivada showed up, and you knew it. So why get involved in something that most businesses run from?
Well, because, and it's a combination of things, as is often the case, right? So, and it was, and I just want to finish one other point. I don't know, because I want to be very, very clear with your viewers and listeners on this. The project, the Outernet, Rivada's mission, the spectrum rights that we are using, the filing, they are out, extracted. They are not part of the K-LEO Chinese thing. And that happened years ago. Done. And to touch on your pinstripe comment, I love a fight. And I just do. And, there is something to that fighting Irish thing. And I do love a fight. And I mean, there is nothing better to fight than a communist. I mean, it's what I was born for. It's what I was brought up for. And I mean, here is a chance to fight the Communist Party of China, the greatest shower of what's on the face of the planet. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to mount this fight. There are other people that fight the Communist Party of China in different ways, like my friend Jimmy Lai. He's my pinned tweet on my X, on my Twitter. Jimmy is in solitary confinement in Stanley Prison every day, denied all sorts of things, his rights to practice his faith and everything else. The sacrifice that Jimmy is making, the stand that he is making for the freedom of all Chinese people, and of course of Hong Kong.
And freedom of the press.
And very much so. Thank you. As Apple Media, as the freedom of the press. If Jimmy, my friend, can make a stand like he's making, this is a small thing by comparison for the likes of me to be willing to stand up and fight these so-and-sos on something as significant as this, frankly.
So then I got to ask you, looking back, you would do this again?
Oh, in a heartbeat. Are you kidding? I love every moment of it.
Declan, thank you so much for making the time to come on the Downlink podcast.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So just wow. And remember that there is an ongoing arbitration action between K-LEO's American and European shareholders and the two Chinese companies who are legally barred from completely owning K-LEO. The outcome of this arbitration is expected sometime within the next 3 to 4 months, but it will definitely decide which side gets to buy out who and for how much, and therefore who controls K-LEO and its intellectual property, its patents. So to get a more strategic perspective on what you've just heard, I reached out to Dean Cheng. He's really one of the United States' top thinkers on China-U.S. relations. He's a non-resident fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and also at the George Washington University Space Policy Institute. And until recently, he was a senior advisor to the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's also the author of multiple books, most recently, China and the Moon Race. Here's our conversation. Hello, Dean. Thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Dean, you are an expert in all kinds of warfare that the People's Republic of China uses to get the end that they want, from traditional methods to hybrid methods to island building, territory grabs, and cyber attacks. And you have done a fair amount of thinking and publishing on lawfare and the space domain, very specifically. Now, our audience has just heard from Declan Ganley of Rivada, so I think we have at least a clue about lawfare, but it sure would be great to have your definition and how lawfare in general fits into China's playbook, generally speaking. Dean.
So lawfare needs to be put into the context of how the Chinese think about these sorts of approaches in general. And that is under the broader rubric of political warfare. And political warfare basically is the efforts to influence and shape perceptions. So it's a lot about information of foreign and domestic leaders, foreign and domestic populations. Because as the Chinese will tell you, the first target of political warfare actually is a domestic audience. So domestic messaging, propaganda, social media, media in general are all tools of how China informs and influences its own population, but then everybody else. Within the political warfare context, and the word warfare is very important because when the Chinese are talking about political warfare, it is efforts non-traditional military. So there are economic aspects, there's political aspects, there's media aspects. What they're trying to do is they are trying to use these tools to help achieve strategic goals. Reunification with Taiwan, reducing international sanctions and embargoes on China's access to technology, all of these sorts of things. So that's political warfare. Now, within the Chinese concept of political warfare, they have what they term the three warfares: public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. Public opinion warfare, also sometimes called media warfare, is from the Chinese perspective maybe the most important because it's constant and ongoing. It is a shaping of world views of China. It is trying to make sure the world never looks at China as a threat, always sees China as a positive force, and therefore helps set the foundation for Chinese diplomacy and Chinese trade deals and Chinese investment. Psychological warfare, sort of the dark side of public opinion warfare, is the ability to pressure, to remind other countries of and populations of how important China is. So, for example, then Secretary of State Clinton at one point was talking about how, China has so much of our debt that we have to be nice to them. Now, first off, anyone who has looked at this from an economics perspective will tell you if you owe the bank $100, the bank owns you. If you owe the bank $1 billion, you own the bank. So, but the other aspect here is that the Chinese themselves were playing up the, we own a lot of your debt. You need us for supply chain aspects. You need us for rare earths. Whether they say anything or not, the hope is that you, a decision maker, financial, economic, private government, will always have that in the back of your mind. Do I want to risk angering my economic partner, my investor, this really big country, this nuclear armed country? And then legal warfare. And the most important thing about legal warfare, besides the fact that it works with public opinion warfare and psychological warfare, is that it's never about what's actually legal. That is absolutely central and essential to understanding. Because from the Chinese perspective, legal warfare is the use, and this is what they themselves write in their doctrine. Legal warfare is about the use of laws, treaties, regulations, courts, law enforcement agencies to achieve strategic goals. It is not about determining what is legal, but using all of these pieces to get to what I want. And part of this is tied to a fundamental cultural, historical aspect. The West is rule of law. At least in theory, we are all equal before the law. Presidents, plumbers, paupers. China and Asia writ large has never really been rule of law, it's ruled by law. You are never going to use the law to govern the emperor or the emperor's agents. And in fact, the judiciary was not a separate branch of government from the emperor. The emperor ran the courts. The law existed as a tool for imperial rule and these days for Communist Party rule. So all of that combines to make legal warfare a very different thing when practiced by China, which, by the way, who will practice it against corporations as well as governments, than legal warfare is thought of here in the West.
So then how does China employ lawfare for its desired outcomes in the space domain? Right? Because we've just been hearing about Rivada's legal war, because it's more than just one battle, that's for sure. Are there any particularities that are for the space domain?
Well, one of the interesting things a few years back involved a company called Global IP. And Global IP was basically contracting with Boeing to purchase a satellite to do a variety of space communications. That company basically needed investment, got a number of Hong Kong-based investors. Those investors then in turn, quite reasonably according to our law, said, hey, I've invested enough money. I have seats on the board. I'd like to look over these contracts. Due diligence, perfectly reasonable. I'm not actually trained as an engineer, so I'd like to bring in some other folks who are trained engineers to look over the blueprints of these satellites that we're purchasing. Interesting. They brought in professionals who appear to have been affiliated with mainland China. And since they were simply reviewing, it wasn't clear whether it was even a violation of ITAR, arms export controls, or any other high-tech sanctions, because they were simply reviewing the contract. This is a different form of lawfare. It is basically taking our laws, in this case, financial boards, what can they do, what's their power and responsibility, what does due diligence mean, and using that to circumvent other laws that they don't like, in this case, export control regulations. So these are the sorts of things. We have also seen the Chinese apply these, increasingly make the point that Starlink needs to be treated not as a private company, but as a representative of a government. And here we have the Outer Space Treaty, which basically, and the associated ancillary treaties, that basically says a satellite is the responsibility of the launching country. It may be owned by a private company, it may be operated by a private company, but in terms of who is responsible for it, and the Chinese have been pushing the argument that Starlink, insofar as it is providing direct assistance to Ukraine, a party in a war, should not be seen simply as a private company, but is instead an entity whose satellites were launched from the United States, and therefore is not a neutral, or alternatively, should act like a neutral, which means not directly aiding one side or the other, or else it becomes a combatant. So these are some interesting examples of where the Chinese are really pushing sort of the frontier of legal reasoning, driven not by a desire to set out the law, but because they have their own strategic goals and interests. And they are trying to use and manipulate the law and international treaties to that end.
So, because some of the fine thinking and very fine reporting and writing by other journalists and defense and space experts like yourself, it's come before my very untrained eyes that the situation K-LEO and eventually Rivada have encountered really comes down to spectrum, having the capability to use that spectrum or the right to use that spectrum. And that really means also having the first right to use it over others, which is called priority, right? Now, Liechtenstein owns the priority in a part of the Ka and Ku bands that Rivada now has the right to commercialize. The thing is, that's the very same kind of radio frequency band that's best to use if you want to maintain command and control of hypersonic vehicles. So, Dean, how important is that to China's strategy?
Well, hypersonic vehicles play a very significant role in China's what's termed anti-access area denial or counter-intervention strategy. China has built a variety of hypersonic vehicles, which we believe are intended to target American carrier groups. And that is a key part of our ability to operate within the so-called First Island chain. If you look at the map, Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, down to the Straits of Malacca. Hypersonic glide vehicles, hypersonic vehicles in general, one, they come in very fast, hence the term hypersonic. But the glide vehicle aspect also means that they are potentially maneuverable, which makes them much harder to shoot down. Shoot down, whether it's with Aegis and SM-6 or Patriot and THAAD, and those are the systems that defend places like Guam. So as China fields a variety of HGVs, hypersonic glide vehicles, the ability to control them, especially if you're going to try and barrage places like Guam, or potentially places like Okinawa, or places like Taiwan, or the Carl Vinson carrier battle group, that becomes very, very important.
So would China covet Liechtenstein's and Rivada's Ka and Ku rights?
I think China would covet those rights for a variety of reasons. We just talked about the hypersonic glide vehicles, but the other thing to keep in mind is that China is building out at least 3 proliferated low Earth orbit constellations. Guowang National Network, Qianfan, 1,000 sails, also previously known as G60 Starlink, Honghu 3, and now something called G-Space. All of these seem to rely upon the Ka and Ku bands to provide services. Now, why are they pushing P-LEO? Because of in part, the success of Starlink, not just in the strategic military sense as we've seen in Ukraine, but broadly speaking, the ability to provide global connectivity, global information movement, the Chinese want a piece of that. I think the Chinese are also pretty clear that they would, with their very deep pockets and state subsidies, be more than willing to take on the task of driving Elon Musk out of business, at least in the realm of proliferated low Earth orbit constellations. So, yes, the Chinese would love to be able to secure as much Ka and Ku bandwidth as they can. And their past history with things like PNT, position, navigation, timing networks, is that they are sometimes prepared to step on other people's previously allocated frequencies. And by the time things are resolved, that can take quite a long time. Many companies do not have as deep a set of pockets and either cut a deal or perhaps are driven out of business.
I'd like to know, what do you think about the fact that China ran into one Declan Ganley and Rivada? Because they've been practicing lawfare, right? I can't expect that they saw him coming.
I think on the one hand, I suspect you're correct that the Chinese never identified a specific person who was going to somehow come and throw spanners and monkey wrenches into their plans. But I think what they have developed, and we see this with the growth of actual commercial space entities in China, is the realization that there are a lot of smart people out there who don't belong to the state. And I would use the term strategic entrepreneur, people who are business people who have the ability to really have a strategic impact, a broad political impact, whether through the virtue of their technology and their company, or because they themselves are wealthy and want to make a difference. And I think that this, the fact that Mr. Musk decided that I'm going to throw the resources of Starlink and SpaceX behind Ukraine, which has been a huge factor in keeping the Ukrainians in the fight against the Russians. Chinese are very, very worried about this. But they were worried even before this about people like Musk and Bezos and others simply producing technological innovations that might overturn China's ability to compete. So that it's that combination of technological expertise, corporate wealth creation, and then personal individuals who decide how they want to spend their billions, that I think is a very lethal combination potentially from Beijing's perspective.
So just to wrap everything up, how strategic or not are the recent legal losses for China's plans that have come out of the whole Rivada, K-Leo, try and, dust up here?
I'm going to be, very, very sage here and say it's probably too soon to tell. But what I would also say is that on the one hand, the fact that the Chinese have lost some of these cases is incredibly important because it serves to signal Beijing that they are not simply going to steamroll their way forward. That there are companies and individuals, for example, who will fight them and will fight them even when you're running into millions of dollars worth of legal fees. The flip side to that is that no one should be under the illusion that, China has lost 1 to 5 legal cases. Now they will basically go home. The Chinese system, the CCP system, I'm reminded of Kyle Reese's description of Terminators. It won't show pity, it won't show remorse, and it will not stop until it has achieved its goal. So in that regard, I think that the Chinese system is going to continue pursuing its overall goals with regards to bandwidth, with regards to PLEO, with regards to commercial space development. These are momentary setbacks. These are potentially important setbacks, but they're only setbacks, and that the Chinese are going to keep on keeping on.
Dean, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you again for having me.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.